Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final session today in this wonderful Elliott room. We are returning to the topic of AI and public interest, which is where we started out this morning as well. So really nice to kind of come back to that topic. And this is something that it's actually particularly close to my heart as well, because I'm someone without a STEM degree, but someone who's very invested in getting AI and the public interest right. So super, super excited to be joined by this excellent panel who will explore the role of social sciences, humanities, and the arts in delivering the sort of evidence methods and insights that can help ensure that AI policies actually incentivize AI in the public interest. So I have a real pleasure to hand you over to Professor Sonia Livingstone, who's going to be moderating this panel for you. Enjoy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming towards the end of this afternoon. This panel is organised by the British Academy, which is the UK's National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences, and our SHAPE acronym, which we're going to be exploring a little today, stands for the Social Sciences, Humanities and Arts for the People and Economy. The fellows and all those involved with the British Academy are really trying to find productive and insightful ways of bringing knowledge from those disciplines into the public debates that matter, of which AI is definitely one, and in fact of which the public interest itself is another. So today we're going to be exploring the role of those disciplines in relation to the challenges of AI, asking, I think, a question that is being asked across the whole day and indeed at the summit in Paris. What are the ways in which AI should be forged in the public interest, if that's possible, if that's desirable, and can the academics working in the British Academy make a contribution, perhaps together with their colleagues in STEM disciplines around the country and elsewhere. And with that kind of thought in mind, the British Academy has been working on the possibilities of AI and good work. It's been working on the idea of public interest in relation to public interest media, and most recently it's published a series of essays imagining the good society from a whole range of perspectives, some of them quite provocative, some of them kind of setting out what the different disciplines have to contribute, and that's kind of the questions I'm going to be asking our panellists today. So I'm going to introduce the four panellists. Who are each going to then give a 2-minute provocation. We'll then have an exploration of their differences or similarities. I think it depends how provocative they are. And then there will be time for you to ask questions also. And I think we're going to, well, perhaps some brilliant definitions of AI have already emerged during the day's discussions, but we're going to kind of keep our conception quite broad, though I think really people are focusing on generative AI increasingly these days. Perhaps in the order in which I might ask people to speak, I'm going to first introduce Kate Miltner. Dr. Kate Miltner is a lecturer in data, AI and society at the University of Sheffield, and her research explores issues of power and inequality in digital systems, institutions and cultures. We'll then hear from Professor Shalom Lappin, who is a professor of natural language processing at Queen Mary University, London. And he has recently authored a book called Understanding the Artificial Intelligence Revolution Between Catastrophe and Utopia. I'm looking forward to hearing more about the utopia bit. We'll then hear from Sarah Gold, who is founder and CEO of Projects by If. Sarah's a global digital leader who specialises in the design of trusted digital services in both public and private sectors. And finally, we're going to hear from Dr. John Taylor, who is the CEO of Action.ai and who is industry leader in conversational AI that provides companies with deep expertise in machine learning and computational linguistics. So if I now remember the order, I'm going to start with Kate. 2 minutes strictly. There's a big clock
I'm ready. I timed it.
How can the social sciences and humanities help us define AI in the public interest?
Okay, so right now there is a bit of a controversy that's happening in the art world in relation to AI. How many of you have heard of the augmented intelligence auction that's happening at Christie's? Show of hands. Okay, a couple of people. So for those of you who don't know, Christie's, this very famous auction house, they're planning on doing a sale of AI art, right? And some of this art critiques AI, and the issue that is at hand is that there has also been a letter circulated with over 3,000 signatures from some other artists who have said, well, actually, if you sell this art, you are basically encouraging mass theft because some of the art used, major generative AI models in the art. And I think that this sort of controversy offers a really clear example of the role of shaped disciplines in delivering public interest to AI. Because yes, this debate is on its face about AI, but fundamentally, it's really asking much bigger questions like, what is art? Where does critique begin? And these are questions that I think only the shaped disciplines can answer particularly well, right? So generative AI in particular, I think gets at questions that are at the heart of humanity, the heart of creativity, the heart of imagination. When does AI stop being a tool and start being a replacement, right? What does it mean for artists, for writers, for creatives, for the cultural and creative industries in this country? What does it mean for Britain and their soft power on the world stage? And speaking of power, shaped disciplines help us examine issues of power. And one of the key questions in most of these disciplines is who benefits, right? So who benefits from technologies being designed in certain ways? Who benefits from policies supporting certain stakeholder positions or investments? These are kind of the key questions. And so I've asked to be provocative, so I will drop this slight provocation. And I think that we cannot have public interest AI without the contributions of the shaped disciplines, because it is only through the knowledge and experience of the shaped disciplines that we can truly understand what the public interest is. And I'm also going to say that the public interest is not a monolith. There are many different public interests, and that is why we need multiple disciplines to help us work this out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kate. And actually now I love the question, what is art, which could actually take us in a whole direction. But I would say as an academic, it's also been leading us to ask the question, and what is education?
Yes.
If our students are going to have Gen AI write their essays, and maybe we can grade them that way too. So I think a lot of different areas of society are indeed thinking about some pretty fundamental questions. Yes. Brilliant. So, Shalom.
Okay, thank you. I find that as I get older, one of the joys of dotage is that you get to say whatever you want because nobody takes you seriously enough to bother.
I'm writing it down.
And the result is that I don't manage to provoke anyone except my wife and children, and that's not because of what I say, but because of what I do, or more accurately, what I don't do. So I straddle the engineering, natural science part, or mathematical science, computer science part of the discipline, and shape areas, because I'm a computer scientist working on AI, and I'm also a linguist coming from a logic background. Actually, this is not unique or remarkable in AI, because the field, very few people bother to look at the history of AI, which started, I suppose, with Turing right here with his monumental paper on computable functions in the 30s, and then his work in Bletchley Park. But at its founding in the 50s at a conference in the States, at Dartmouth, the people who were assembled, they didn't even know what AI was, but they created a discipline, were an interesting collection of people coming from, actually one of the main figures was Rosenblatt, who was a psychologist and created the perceptron, which is the foundations for current neural networks, which gave us large language models after many decades of. But also there were mathematicians and neuroscientists and physicists and logicians and philosophers. So it was at its founding a multidisciplinary endeavor, and it remained that way when I was at IBM and research. People were coming from a wide variety of fields, which included shape. They were working on human-computer interaction, etc. One of the things that's not appreciated is that AI is a commercially successful venture is a very recent phenomena. Basically, at most 20 years. One of the reasons, I can't speak for Kate, but one of the reasons you're hearing a second North American accent here is because they were closing down or about to close down the AI section of IBM research in Hawthorne, and I wanted to go back to the university, and then they didn't close it, and I still came. So AI lived a very tenuous life for the first 50 years of its existence, and only started to blossom about 10, 15 years ago with the extraordinary success of deep learning models. What I'd like to suggest very briefly, if it can be called a provocation, is more, I would like to see it as an alternative perspective, is that the idea is that funding for AI research should come from private industry, and particularly the tech companies. I think this is a drastic mistake. The result, you get what you pay for. And what we're getting now is a frenzy of very clever and important engineering work that's driven largely by profit. There's nothing wrong with profit if it benefits broader social concerns, but the kind of research that's needed to do that, which is deep research and basic research, is very often not going on. The funding agencies like the EPSRC and the ESRC do not have that kind of funding. And the result is that the creation of clever machines which can learn a lot in a much shorter period of time with less energy and less destructive purposes is not available to us because there's very little profit in that kind of research in the short term. So I would suggest that until basic funding for basic research is made available through the public domain, as it is in physics, as you look at the Hadron Collider, we will not see the kinds of developments in AI which we need in order to achieve social benefit as well as scientific progress.
Thank you. Okay. Outcomes in the public interest must be paid for by the public purse. And I think that's interesting. Okay, everyone has come to be provocative. Fantastic. Sarah,
Yeah,
you don't have to be, but you may.
I'm a designer, so I had to look up what shape was when I was asked to join this panel, because I'd not heard of it before. So I sit slightly adjacent to the arts part, but design, for those of you who may be less familiar with it, it's not only about making things look delightful and work. It's actually, how do we make sure that these systems are designed around people's needs and actually work for humans. So it's a really important part of how we get from foundational AI into applied AI, and then actually that you have these tools in your pocket, able to use them, and they reliably work most of the time. That's what we do. So as a designer, what I see is that actually when you talk to people in user research, so when you're going out and designing your products and services, you'll have sessions with members of the public, and you'll ask them about how a particular product or service works for them, to glean insights that you can then use to develop that product or service. And increasingly with AI, what we hear in our research is that there's just this expectation that AI will be there, that actually people are able to actually talk to their phone or their computer, and that we have this future interaction model where we're not only going to be able to touch any screen that's around us, but talk to it too. And that fundamentally changes what we think is possible, but also what we might entrust these systems to deliver for us. Particularly as we go down the route of generative AI systems being conversational, that really changes what we expect to hear back. But generative AI doesn't have many of the kind of understanding that we do as humans about conversations, whether that be our intent, particular forms of humour, body language. And so really, as we're using these tools and building them into our products and services, we're fundamentally also changing the way that we can expect to interact with them. And I don't think that all of those ways of interacting are really in the public benefit or interest. And so I think there's a huge role for design to play in playing back some of those risks, but also designing some of those interfaces to better align with interests of the public too. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. I hope we're going to maybe dig in a little more to the question about how we draw those lines between what is and what isn't in the public interest. I was listening to you, I was thinking my research is on children and how they engage with technology, and of course they don't already have their idea of what is human and what is human interaction. They are growing up in this world and their ideas will be shaped in the wrong sense, perhaps. Yes, so something to explore anyway. John. Thank you.
To provoke, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm John. So my background is shape. So that was my first degree, it was my PhD. And I now find myself running an AI company, and for the last 15 years been working in tech with mostly, not exclusively, but mostly STEM educated people who are extremely good and smart people to work with. And what I'm finding in the kind of popular debate about AI, and Shalom captured it beautifully, I thought, but there tends to be a sense that tech builds, which is STEM, let's say, STEM builds, and shape then maybe shapes it for society's good. Right? There's a sort of there are two boxes, and there's very little intersection. Well, of course, there is a lot of intersection. Partly because, as Shalom said, a lot of the companies that we're talking about here do employ people with pretty hybrid backgrounds. We do too. However, STEM has great advantages over shape. It's arguably often quite quantifiable. It's hugely respected. It's identified with building. It's worked with innovation, progress, speed, optimization. These words are the zeitgeist. They are sexy. They are exciting. They are what gets media attention. Shape is about really, really fundamental important things like ethics and transparency and fairness and power. And I could go on. And if we named any single shape discipline, you could throw one at me, that you could say, what do anthropologists do? They've got a huge role to play. What about economists? They've got a huge, and we could go on all day and find a role for all of them. Medieval poets, I have a role for them too, everybody. But the current narrative isn't that. So how do we start to change the narrative, in my view, that is less STEM oriented? I think the privatization of AI is a real challenge to that, and I think that, and it does mean that there's a strong narrative. You know, companies like mine and many others will often herald breakthroughs. Some of them less honest than the people I work with, herald breakthroughs that are not quite real or exaggerated. And arguably, their press release doesn't often say a lot about equity or power or balance. So how do we, as people who are passionate about shape, and I think the people on this panel have that in common, how do we manage this? So we're talking about interdisciplinary education, we're talking about interdisciplinary decision-making. We can't rely on one company, however large that company is, to set the goals here, nor can we rely on one single government. So we have a really difficult problem because the AI revolution is different for one reason and one reason only from every other revolution we've seen industrially, which is it has a speed, I think Shalom said 20 years, I think that's at most. So the commercial exploitation of AI, you could argue it's 15, 10, 12, it's very short. It's moving incredibly rapidly with energy momentum that has never been seen before, with implications on humanity that we've never seen before. And so our ability to capture those, to act at speed as people who are passionate about equity, fairness and shape disciplines is really, really, really challenged. Where's the funding going to come from? Where's the expertise coming from? Where's the power? Where's the voice in the debate? So my provocation is only really that it's not a branding issue. That's too trite. It's too trivial. But if we are too worthy in our conversations and our writing about the shape disciplines, and their academic in particular, then unfortunately the very well-funded voices that are not sensitive to those concerns probably keep winning, and they are winning now by, I think it's hard to say they are not. So that's a real concern, but maybe I'm wrong. That'd be good. I'm happy to be wrong. I'd love to be wrong about this.
I mean, let's think about the worthiness. I like that point because I think, so I was just gathering that in the parallel real, as it were, process in Paris, Britain and the US have decided not to sign up to the statement for all of its worthy words: open, inclusive, ethical, rights-oriented and so forth. Is there, so this might be an impossible question for my panellists, but do you see ways in which we can think of the public interest without those long lists of somehow weighty, worthy words, or is it that we need to work harder, I think as John is implying, to make those words seem less worthy and more exciting and full of promise?
Just very briefly, I think one thing that I find tremendously exciting and positive about the whole, despite my negative worldview you just heard, is that when stories about AI emerge and they have a social good, or often it's around medicine, as you know, or maybe it's oriented around climate change, those stories do resonate. They capture the public imagination, I believe. They feature at the top of news bulletins. That shouldn't be the only thing that matters, I realise that. But it's helpful when we kind of instantiate these things in something that is clear and understandable by, we'll call it everybody, but the general public. And when they're anchored in things that have real benefit, I think that helps create a debate about that thing that has happened, cancer diagnosis. And that is a way into this conversation, because AI isn't that complicated at all, really, at a high level. But it is presented in such a way that makes it quite forbidding for most people.
Kate?
I have some thoughts. So, I mean, I think, what you've just said, John, illustrates the bias that there is in the sciences towards disciplines that are kind of, reproducible, seen as measurable, and, as you said, that means quantitative data. And I think one of the challenges that, us in the shape disciplines tend to face is that we are constantly having to prove ourselves. And I think that there's a really incorrect perception that the research that we do that often has, qualitative methods, participatory methods, even artistic methods, that somehow that's like wishy-washy, that's not robust, that's not hard evidence. And, that's just not true, right? So I think if we're going to end up having the type of AI that we want, the type of AI that works for lots of different types of people, we need to have a bunch of different methods to get a bunch of different data and incorporate all of that. One of my professors early on in my career said, very obviously, but also very true, like, if you want to know what people think, you have to talk to people. And I think there is a limit to, what STEM methods can do. Like, you can't just, scrape Reddit, do a sentiment analysis on it, and then get the full picture, right? Like, that's not going to give you what it is that you really need to know. So I think, the sort of perception that, we're all doing underwater basket weaving or whatever, which is, as an English major in my undergraduate degree, I, kind of heard all the time, like, you were talking about the medieval poets and what's their role. Well, I mean, I think one of the unique things about Shape is that it helps us understand historical context and what is unique about this moment, which is not unique about this moment. You were saying that things are totally, this is a totally unprecedented moment, and it may seem like that, but actually, if we're looking at the core issues here, connected to automation, we're looking at labor, we are looking at rights, we are looking at environmental impact, and if you look at what is, if you look at the introduction of like the printing press and the Industrial Revolution and, the introduction of computation into the workplace, like we keep running into the same issues over and over again. So do SHAPE degrees, folks, because, you get to learn about all those things.
I'd love to add on that, which is, I think, from the design perspective, so how do you like implement and integrate these technologies into products and services? I do think there's a gap of... So I guess to answer the first question, which was, is there a version of AI in the public interest that doesn't include those issues? I honestly think the answer is no. They have to be present. However, when you're working with organisations at the coalface of actually needing to ship this stuff, some of the kind of ethical principles are so high level and academic, and that they have a reason. There's a reason that they're there. They're needed, but we need greater translation from those ideals into actually how do you work with this stuff. So when we talk about fairness as being a key part of what we expect public interest AI to have, how do we begin to like actually really think about that in the products and services that we ship? How do we measure it? How do we baseline it? How do we measure it over time? These are really, these are challenges that are emerging. There are no single answers to these kinds of problems because, of course, also fairness isn't an issue just to be found within the AI model itself. You then have to look at the wider system it sits within. So I think that there is, for me, it's not a worthiness gap, but there's an implementation gap that we're still not seeing being met. And just this week, the UK government published its updated generative AI principles. And when you look at them, there's 10 principles. They've put them on 10 posters. They sound good, but then you actually think about how you're going to implement them. How, as a team, would you actually say that the way that you're applying generative AI is legal and ethical, they say? I don't think anyone right now can actually say, yes, we've got that down, we know how we're doing it. So to me, how useful are some of these statements to people who really need them in products? Obviously, I have that biased perspective, but to me, we're not doing enough to really help product people. Also, to connect these issues to the kind of commercial incentives they have to use to do their jobs. So I think there's a gap there, but slightly, I guess, separate to that. There's a role for the arts, but in design, how do we really make these things useful? There is a gap.
I mean, Shalom, thank you. And you talked about kind of straddling the shape and the stem. And I wonder if in your work then you see ways in which high-level principles can kind of be implemented in practice. And maybe you have some good stories to tell.
These are hard questions, but I do think one of the main issues, and Kate sort of touched on this, and I think it's an important point, is that it's not the case that people coming from more traditional humanities and social sciences have always been excluded from scientific discussion. I mean, it wasn't simply the founding conference of AI that had a lot of them there. Turing's original paper, which was maybe the founding document of AI, was called Thinking Machines or Intelligence, was published in Mind, which is a British philosophy journal. So the first audience were philosophers, and he was a mathematician. These boundaries meant nothing. You followed a problem. Nobody looked at your passport in terms of the degree that you got. My degrees are all in philosophy with a focus on mathematical logic. I'm a computer scientist. Nobody asked, why is that? So yes, I mean, what you were saying is absolutely correct. And I think there's a long tradition of this. Carnap, who is an important philosopher, founded a very important branch of probability theory, which is the basis for a lot of AI work now, is generating probability distributions over events. There is unfortunately a kind of self-inflicted illiteracy, scientific illiteracy, that has taken shape, that has taken hold of whole portions, and not only the academic community, but a more general educated public. And the result is that people have put AI practitioners in the role of high priests. We were discussing this. You could use this to great effect, of course, as we decided we could get discounts on guitars in good places in restaurants. But it's actually a very negative thing, because people are being asked to discuss issues where they don't know the science, and the science is not as forbidding as you might think. Right? I mean, think of this. How could you make important decisions about nuclear energy without knowing at least the basics of particle physics? You don't have to be a physicist to do that, but you do have to take the trouble to find out how these things work, how a reactor works, in order to evaluate whether it's dangerous for your neighborhood. In the same way, you have to take a certain amount of time to read properly on the foundations, engineering and scientific, of AI, in order to make intelligent decisions about public good and what the benefit is, so that these moral principles have more than rhetorical content. I think it shapes responsibility to insist on education that crosses these disciplinary boundaries and makes sure that people are literate, so that when they talk to AI technicians and engineers, they are well enough informed to be able to challenge them. I mean, when DeepSeek was announced a couple of weeks ago, I suddenly find, again, as usually happens with my kids, who after many years of treating me as a hopeless nerd, suddenly saying, "Dad, what's this about? Do I have to worry about NVIDIA?" A friend from Belgium, as a matter of fact, texting in, "Are you worried about the stock market?" I said, "I don't have stocks, so how can I worry about the stock market?" But the papers for DeepSeek I immediately found them on the web, and they tell you very clearly what these devices can do. And you began to see people behaving irrationally because they hadn't bothered to consult the most elementary facts about the design and functioning of these devices. And I think without this level of scientific literacy, we're going to be in a very difficult situation for many years to come.
I mean, I do think this raises some really interesting questions about who should be part of this kind of AI literate world, and how widely should it be spread. And I'm hearing, both so in my world, everyone is saying, let's redo the school curriculum. Children have all got to be taught about AI. We need that in the AI literacy is the new thing. But at the same time, we're hearing about how much the tech is, I don't know, black boxed, inexplainable. Even the computer scientists don't understand how it works, or how on earth can the public understand?
I think there is a little bit of I would argue, and this is I'm already thinking it's unfair to say, but slight learned helplessness in that actually, if we want to create AI systems that we can accurately say how they deliver the outcomes or processes that they do, then we have to start looking, for example, at smaller models. And having there are particular architectures and decisions that we can make so that we can make claims at the end. So I think there is sometimes a bit of a sense of AI is always going to be a black box, but it doesn't need to necessarily be if we are actually thinking about these as kind of full stack challenges. And on your point about, to what extent who should be AI literate? I think when you, as I do, go out and do user research with folks, people are living really busy, hard lives, and you can't escape the context, particularly in the UK. We have a serious cost of living crisis. More families are looking at, serious issues of homelessness. They haven't got time to understand whether something's got AI or not, and really, quite frankly, I don't think they should have to either. And so I think there is also perhaps, I don't know if there is a historical reference to this, but this idea of kind of individual responsibility to understand. And yet I think we need to be able to rely on organisations that represent more of us, those being within civil society, who in the UK are really underfunded right now, but to help us understand these things, because the majority of people just don't have space or time, and I don't know that they should have to either. So, yeah.
I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, but I think it maybe depends what you mean by understand, I guess. It's hard to define that, isn't it? Because I think all I mean is a fairly, I read very high level. I don't mean reading academic papers at all. I just mean some vague context. So journalism at the moment is arguably not doing a tremendously good job of explaining what's really happening. It's doing a really good job of following exciting things like shiny baubles, and I'm not sure that helps the public good.
No,
or certainly public information.
I think there's a question of what should you need to understand, what is important for the public, because I think even today, if you were to ask someone, how does a letter that I write get to you, they'd really struggle to tell you.
Sure.
So start then thinking about automation on top of a very human-led process. Well, that's really hard. So
I think it is hard.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Well, sorry, now I'm jumping in. I think people will only learn and only make it their business to learn when there is a meaningful choice available to them. And I think what people very often feel in relation to the way AI is just suddenly in our phone, in our search, in our health, wherever it is people don't feel they have the choice, and that's why they kind of sit back and think, this is too much. And so it is partly about whether the designers, the developers, are creating meaningful choices, and then people, yeah.
And I think something to think about with this discourse about AI, because it is a discourse, is that not too long ago, the same exact discourse existed about learning to code, right? So learning to code, right? Yes. So learning to code and how much you need to code is something, I mean, I think it was 2009 that Douglas Rushkoff came out with Program or Be Programmed, right? So, the whole idea that if you don't understand exactly the nuts and bolts of how your, website works, your phone, whatever, then somehow you are going to be left behind on the information superhighway. This is something that has been a long debate. What amount of literacy, right? We talk about digital literacy, coding literacy, AI literacy, AI knowledge, education. I mean, this is like a big debate about, and it's not just about AI. This isn't new. People have been talking about how much do you really need to understand the technology that you use on a day-to-day basis in order to make meaningful decisions about how you want it to impact your life. And I think, I agree with you, Sarah, that the onus being put on the individual, I mean, is is absurd, right? Because who has the time to do that? You know, I think that there is a role. I think, you know, yeah, I have some,
That's good.
Thank you.
I mean, isn't it partly that? I mean, I don't disagree with any of that, of course, or anything anyone said hardly, but I guess maybe I would take just a slight pause about the historical comparisons, which are very informative. But my own view, and for what it's worth, is I think the phrase AI revolution is not in fact overblown. That's my view. I know the media get behind it, and there's lots of problems with that. But I do believe that is the case. So I think the change to the way in which we work and live, the delivery of services, all the things that we're discussing and touching on here, is going to change really quite significantly. And I think it's not. And I don't believe actually that there will be there will be new jobs, but lots and lots of jobs that require phenomenally deep AI skills. Arguably, to your point about coding, maybe coding skills become less important over time, except for a rare few. But it's just trying to find a way of decisioning in an environment where the AI revolution is occurring. And I agree with you on individual, completely, it's got to be a systemic thing, isn't it? Because if you buy into there being an AI revolution at tremendous speed and momentum and in energy, which I certainly do, with implications for every part of life, then the historical comparison is really useful. But I fear that, you know, we draw lessons as much as we should, absolutely draw lessons, but we've got to move so incredibly quickly in response to what is happening, and that is really difficult. And it's not for the individuals. I couldn't agree more with that.
But do we though? Like, do we need to move at the speed at which we're moving? I think, you know, the panel that was in this room, 2 panels before, about the creative industries, you know, they were questioning whether we need to be making the decisions that we're making right now at the speed at which we are making them. Like, what is the urgency? You know, and I think that is that I'm not saying that I'm not kind of coming down hard either way, but I think that, you know, the way that we are talking about all of this, we're almost like bringing it into being, right? Like, we are bringing the revolution into being simply by talking about it. And I think the question is, you know, I was recently part of a grant where we were talking to people about how they were implementing responsible AI into different institutional contexts. And like, no one's really doing much yet because they don't want to do it wrong. So I think there's like a debate about how much this is actually happening at the speed at which, you know, the press and, you know, events like this are saying that it's happening. I think, you know, it could be happening really fast, but I don't know.
Shoulders down.
Yeah, exactly.
Breathe deeply.
Right, maybe we just take a pause.
And I'm also going to take an opportunity if folks here would like to ask questions. And Netta has got a brilliant. So a microphone, so please wait for that. Yes, so I'll take this one first. We might take, I'm just looking at the clock, we might take the 3 hands that I just saw, and then you can answer whichever question most fits your bill, as it were. Don't feel you've got to answer them all. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Maria. I work in software, and I'm an alumnus of the LSE Media and Communications program as well.
Fantastic.
So happy to be in a lecture room with you again. My question, I think, just regarding the discussion about the general understanding of what AI is and the fact that there is, I also agree, a high-level understanding that could be communicated more to people. I've been thinking a lot about this quote from John Durham Peters. It's a bit straying from AI for a moment, but he spoke a bit about how the term the cloud for you know, mass software and data centers, he said that that was one of the greatest PR successes of the tech industry, partially in how vague and confusing it is, and how completely misleading it is as well. So I've been thinking about that as well with just the term AI itself, artificial intelligence. I was wondering if you all think that's an apt term, or if it's also misleading. Should it be renamed mass pattern recognition machine, something like that? Would that help, you know? Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
I don't know,
very
something
good.
that maybe dissolls that
Theft
the vagueness
was your
that
earlier
is.
word. Mass theft.
Oh, that wasn't my word. I was just reporting on what other people said.
But yeah, if there's some, I don't know, discussion there, is that even an apt term for what it is at all?
Thank you, Maria. And then there were 2 questions here, I think. One there, yeah. Behind Alex. Yeah.
So just to come back to AI literacy, rather than thinking about how we make the public literate in AI, can we not make AI developers, deployers, and decision makers more literate in how the public feels?
Yes. Okay. Well, other questions that people would like to? Yes, at the back. Thank you.
Hi. There seems like there's an irony that the social sciences and the humanities feel excluded from developments in AI, given the sort of pragmatic rejection of certain cognitivist, rationalist theories of perception and language embedded in the very operation of AI as billion-parameter neural network models that don't really have a lot of these, say, for example, theories of logic built, or probability even, built into them. And so on the contrary side, we also see a recreation of the humanities and social sciences within AI research itself, as seen when the public breathlessly waits for a software engineer to weigh in on previously philosophical and sociological questions of trust. So a question is basically, what would it take to get AI researchers to recognize their progressive need to redevelop the social sciences and humanities? Why is that happening? How can they recognize what's gone before? And also for shape scholars to realize that, in a way, neural networks in their very operations preserve or support much of the ambiguity and complexity of thinking and knowledge, which they often prefer to emphasize.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, lots of ums and ahs around on the panel. Anyone want to squeeze in? Or no, I'm going to go in the reverse of the order I did before, if I can remember it, which I think means John.
That's some big questions. How long have
There
we got?
are. You've got a minute.
Very, very quickly. Renaming AI, I can see the rationale, but my goodness, I feel like the genie is out of the lamp, as it were, but some may disagree. The second question was around public interest, I think, and shape and education. So, without mangling an answer to that question, I think when we were talking about STEM and shape, and I think the whole point is that it does need to be interdisciplinary, and I think we think the obligation ought to be in, whether private or public sector, that the incorporation of philosophy, anthropology, social, and all of those disciplines that have so much to offer, including the historical narratives that we've been touching on here, matter tremendously. And I just don't know what those job titles are in large tech companies. I recognise they exist in academia, less so in large tech companies. So I wonder how we manage that and what the incentives, because this is about incentives and motivations. If I'm a high-level engineer in an AI company, then I'm motivated to optimize, to make more efficient, to do well, to pay my own bills, and that's understandable and reasonable. I'm not less or more moral than someone in the shape discipline, but my incentives maybe not be aligned with the ones we'd like to see. And I'll leave the third question mainly because that's a really, really fun one. That's an hour answer.
Okay, then I'll turn to Sarah.
So in terms of the definition, whenever we start working with a client, we kind of have this kick-off moment, and we actually ask, what do you think AI is to the people in the room that we're going to be working with? And the way that we like to break it down, which I think is interesting, is to say, and there's so many different definitions, I should add, and this is not the only one or the right one, but it works for us, is to say that AI is actually made up of people, data, compute, money, power. We kind of break these things down so that AI, we don't start off with this idea of, that AI is kind of magic or some monolith thing. So I think it's interesting to find definitions that work in your context and help people think differently and more critically to begin with. And on that final question, although I didn't follow all of it, the bit that I would say is that what I find so interesting is when I'm asked, how do you build trust with AI? And it's actually just, how do you build trustworthy systems, full stop, that are made of untrustworthy humans and untrustworthy pixels and untrustworthy technical systems. And I think that we have to think of each of those things as being potential threats and prioritize those. But I do think it's very interesting in some of our research that we hear that sometimes people have that automation bias, that they believe that the computer is more correct than a human, or sometimes the opposite, that a human is more correct than a computer. And so our job as designers is to kind of calibrate that to make sure that whatever a person decides, they're doing so with a full understanding really of the risks. So yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Shalom.
Yeah, just two really brief points. So one is that there's a certain amount of confusion over the notion of transparency in current neural network models. It's true that it's impossible, or one cannot, predict output on the basis of input. And this is due to what a formal property of these devices because they use what are called nonlinear functions, and therefore you can't reverse engineering the output to get to the input. But we know very well how they work because we design them. So that's different than the kind of lack of transparency that comes from lack of understanding the architecture and the workings of these systems. That's one point. Second, there is a whole movement in AI by computer scientists called explainable AI, which is an attempt to build more transparent systems. More traditional AI systems worked with logic programming-based models and functional, and they are fully transparent. And there are now a whole set of models which are called neural symbolic models, which take both neural networks and a kind of rule-based, logic-based reasoning and combine them, because neural networks are actually not very good at deep reasoning. They're very good at calculation. They're very good at probability projection and risk estimate and pattern recognition. They're not good at deep reasoning and inference, whereas more traditional models are, including statistical models. And that's quite independent and has nothing to do with the issue of rationalist versus empiricist reasoning. And attempts to combine them are interesting, and it's very much a frontier area of AI research. I'm giving a paper on this in Sweden in 2 weeks.
Okay. Thank you. Kate, would you like the last word, I think?
Yes. Oh, how nice. I will be very brief. I think in response to your question, so the cloud is a metaphor, right? And artificial intelligence is also a metaphor. And I think it's one of the things that can be really useful about a metaphor is that people can use it for their own purposes, right? I think the obfuscation may not have been the original point, but I think now it serves the interests of quite a lot of different people. I think the fact that it seems like magic, right? It serves the ends of a variety of stakeholders. So, you know, I think I agree that the cat is out of the bag. I think should we have something that's a bit more clear? Probably. Will we? Probably not. And I think to answer the question in the back very briefly, I think, you know, again, the sort of fetishization of STEM as the sort of like root of all wisdom, sort of, I think we can see what is happening in the US about, you know, the sort of prioritizations of certain epistemologies or ways of knowing. So I think when you are dealing with people who believe that their way of thinking is the best way of doing it, why would you read other stuff? And then when you come across that stuff, why would you not think that you made it up first, right? So on that cheery note.
Well, there is much more. We're not going to resolve things, but I hope people have grasped something of what the social sciences and humanities might bring to this debate, even if there's much to discuss further. I think there's about to be a final plenary, so I can't say speakers are going to be around for a long conversation over coffee, but you know who people are. I do want to thank Alex Manku and Johnny Digby at the BA for arranging this, so thank you so much, and to everyone for their contribution.